When I first read over Acts chapter 27 with a view to preaching from it, I found it very difficult to pick out lessons there for us. Because on first reading, it just looks like narrative. But of course it is narrative. But nothing in the Bible is just narrative. So I believe the best way to deal with this is for me to explain the narrative and then look over what deeper lessons there may be here for us. This morning we will be considering those verses that we read together, the first 25 verses of chapter 27. And the passage opens, "And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus's band." Now, as you'll know, Paul has been held in custody in Caesarea. He's been there for a number of years by successive Roman governors. Nobody has been able to come up with any reason to hold him prisoner, and yet he is not set free. And on his part, to ensure that he wasn't allowed to fall into the hands of the Jews who wished to kill him, he had appealed to Caesar. The current Roman governor had sought advice from King Agrippa, who was outwardly, supposedly Jewish, so that the governor would have something to write to Caesar about Paul. But Agrippa had come to the same conclusion as everybody else, that there was nothing in Paul worthy of him being held prisoner. But as we see here, they were still then determined to send him to Rome. Now, presumably, without any formal charge against him, he would have arrived in Rome and probably been left to fend for himself. Now, from what I can glean, the other prisoners that were with him, they would likely have ended up as gladiators, fighting wild animals, or perhaps even fighting each other. They would have been entertainment for the masses. But you notice also there that Luke starts to use the word "we." So he would have joined them at this point again, and he was present there himself. And in fact, as you read it, it does have all the hallmarks of an eyewitness on the journey. Well, on the first part of the journey, they just had a stop just a little way up the coast at Sidon, and Paul was allowed to visit his friends there. So it seems now there was a church at Sidon, and I suppose that's hardly surprising by that time. And although it says in verse 3 that he had liberty to go to his friends, it is highly likely that there would have been a Roman soldier with him. Although Paul knew that the Lord was sending him to Rome, the centurion could have not known the same thing. Well, so that happens, and then they continue their journey, passing by close to Cyprus. It says in our reading, it says we sailed under Cyprus, which might make us think that they sailed south of Cyprus, but it doesn't actually mean that. It just means they sailed under the protection of Cyprus. It depends on which way the winds were blowing, and Cyprus would have helped them be protected from winds blowing the wrong way. And so they came to Myra in Lycia. That's a part of what is now Turkey. And there they changed ship. And all the prisoners were moved over, and then they set sail once more. But because of the winds, it took them ages to get to a place called Cnidus. That wasn't all that far from where they were. And then they managed to sail southwards towards Crete. And there they also had difficulty sailing, but eventually they came to a place known as the Fair Havens. Sounds like a place out of Lord of the Rings. I suspect Tolkien got the name from the Bible. They arrive then on the Fair Havens, somewhere on the south coast of Crete. And Luke here, he speaks of a fast in verse 9, and that was in all probability then the Day of Atonement. So it was early autumn, the beginning of October. Now, from what I understand, typically sailors docked between September and mid-March. And so Paul, he's simply reminding them of the danger of sailing at that time of year. However, the shipmaster and most of the other sailors, they think the harbour is not a sufficiently good place to winter in, and they determine that they're going to head a little further along the coast. So they launch out in a gentle wind, but that wind is the beginning of a great storm. So it's a deceptively slight wind. It's the beginning of a great storm that blows them way off course. I mean, they were only planning to sail a little way down the coast, and suddenly they're out in the midst of the sea. And so they eventually have to let the ship just be blown along without the sails. That's what strake sail in verse 17 means. And it looks like they were being driven southwards towards Libya, and the quicksands, also mentioned in verse 17, seem to refer to a sandbank that is just off the coast of Libya. Well, their course of action works to some extent, and then they're sailing northwest. So that's once again in the right general direction. But things are not exactly going well for them. The storm is still raging. And so they start throwing things off the ship. They're fearful for their lives. And eventually Paul addresses them. He reminds them that they should have listened to him when they were in the Fair Havens. Now, he's not adopting a kind of, I told you so kind of attitude. He was just reminding them that they really ought to listen to him now. And although his advice to stay in the Fair Havens may well have just been based on knowledge that most people would have had, this time he has had a personal revelation. He tells them that their lives will be spared and that they have no need to fear. So that's the voyage so far. And interesting as all that may be, which is the problem I initially had, is that, but what does it actually teach us? What does it actually teach us? Now, if I were to give this sermon a title, it would most likely be a biblical worldview equals a sound mind. Now, there is more here, but that was the first thing then that jumped out at me. And that's basically based on verses 9 to 12 of this chapter. Paul noted that because their journey as far as the Fair Havens in the south of Crete, because that had taken them much longer than they expected, it was now the time of year when the sea was a dangerous place to be. However, the shipmaster and many others with him thought that it would be okay just to sail a little bit up the coast. Paul's words, they're found in verse 10. He said, "Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives." So you can see there on that occasion, there was no indication of any kind of supernatural revelation. As I say, later on, he did receive a heavenly message, but when that happened, that is clearly brought out. But this time, that first time, he seems to be speaking based on what was common knowledge. And it's worth us noting that because it is in stark contrast to what the majority wanted to do. To the majority there, the risk was small. They're only going up the coast a little bit. But Paul, he is only speaking common sense. The sea is a dangerous place. We all know this at this time of year. And the risk was real, and it wasn't just the cargo that had to be considered, but people, human beings too. Well, as it happened, common sense did not prevail, and they did all end up in danger, not to mention the loss of all the cargo. Now, I suspect that all of us here, we've all bewailed the lack of common sense when we've read a news article or heard something which to our ears is bizarre on TV. And we say, why can't they see the patently obvious? Why can we see the patently obvious, but they can't? And to be fair, it would not be true to say that every unbeliever is devoid of common sense, but it is an increasingly regular phenomenon. And that's because our society is moving further and further away from at least a form of godliness that was once previously prevalent. You see, the more we apply the Bible to every area of our lives, the more we will be in tune with reality. And the reverse is also true. Because of the massive shift away from the Bible that there's been in recent decades, so common sense has now become the enemy. Common sense is only common sense because it fits with the real world. The Bible aligns with the real world because it's true. But for so many people today, truth and reality, well, they're no longer objective things. Everything is subjective because everything must be made to revolve around self, around a person's desires, around what they want. And we see that in so many areas of life these days. But what's come to my attention recently is just how everyone has to be shielded from the real world. Everything, it seems, has to come with a warning. Contains scenes that may cause upset or something like that. I mean, it's attached to so many things. It's as if a whole generation has arisen and infected the whole of society where no one can bear to be offended or upset. But the real world is full of things that offend. It's full of things that cause pain and grief and sorrow and upset. The real world can be a very sad place. If we have a biblical worldview, we will see things as they really are, and we will be enabled to deal with them in the proper way. So if they are things worthy of honour, we will seek ways to encourage a greater degree of such things. If they are things worthy of dishonour and disgrace, we will seek ways in which they can be diminished. In other words, we deal with the real world as it really is. We don't try to hide away from it and pretend that things are not the way they really are. And of course that was, in a sense, all that Paul was doing when he advised that they remain in the fair havens for the winter. Or put another way, all he was doing was encouraging those that were with him to obey the 6th and 8th commandment. I'm sure you know them. Thou shalt not kill, and thou shalt not steal. Now obviously he didn't put it like that. He didn't expect these pagans to know of the 10 commandments. And you might also wonder in what way he was doing this. But as we often acknowledge, the Ten Commandments, that they're a kind of summary of the moral law. So the sixth commandment, it requires us to use all lawful endeavours to preserve our own life and the life of others. And that was exactly what Paul was doing. He said, this voyage will be with hurt and much damage of our lives. And then the eighth commandment requires us to use all lawful means to obtain and increase our own and our neighbours' wealth and outward condition. And that was what Paul then was doing when he said, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage of the lading, that is the cargo, and ship. The thing is, life is full of risks. We cannot deny that. Very often, we weigh up a risk and determine whether it is worth taking or not. And what Paul's behaviour here shows us is that when there is a well-known risk, we should not be putting our lives and the lives of others and their goods, the goods of ourselves and others, we should not be putting them in the front line, as it were. That is what the law of God tells us. And of course, if you say, well, yeah, but storms can arise in the summer too. Oh, yeah, they can. They can. But they are much, much less likely. The risk is much reduced. As I said just now, life is full of risks. And that is the reality of living in a fallen world. A biblical worldview that instills what we could call common sense, it will allow us to work out when a risk is worth taking and when it is not worth taking. And before moving on, this also shows us something we all know and something that many people acknowledge, except when they want to make use of it, and that something is that the majority is not always right. And I suspect that they're rarely right. And so I would just say to you that whenever you feel like a lone voice, why won't anybody listen to me? Well, in such a situation, you mustn't be surprised. You can't be surprised when the majority will not listen, because that's the state, it appears, of the human race. If they don't have a biblical worldview, they are severely crippled when it comes to listening to reason. Now, I said that a biblical worldview equals a sound mind. I said that was the first thing that jumped out at me from this passage. But what else is there? Well, if you'll allow me the liberty of using the voyage out from the Fair Havens as a picture of the world, which I don't think is unreasonable, given that they have not listened to the sound reason from Paul, if we do that, then we can see more. Because the world very often runs into danger because of the lack of understanding of God. Look again at verse 16. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. They took the fair wind as a positive sign. All would be well for them. And that's just like the world. They receive all the good that God bestows on the human race and conclude that if there is a God, he must like them. He must approve of what they do. And they do that. They jump to that conclusion while ignoring everything else that is going on around them that should lead them to see that God is actually angry with them. Now, this is described in Romans 2 and verse 4 like this. Paul says, despisest thou the riches of his goodness and forbearance and long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leadeth thee to repentance. The very fact that God is so good while still being angry with us, is so that we will take that opportunity to repent and be reconciled to him. It's not so that we can just carry on in our rebellion against him. But that is so often the way that the world thinks. And so it, sails on into danger. Well, the danger in our passage is described as Euroclydon, a raging tempest it was. Of course, the real danger that the world is sailing towards is Judgment Day and hell. Everything may seem like smooth sailing today, but that day is approaching with constant rapidity and certainty. Just like that storm Euroclydon was awaiting those hapless sailors in the Mediterranean. It was there, but they took no notice. The day of judgment won't really be a surprise to anyone once it comes. It's not like we don't have sufficient warnings that things are not well between man and God. Perhaps this storm is like them, a warning that worse is to come. Well, the first thing that these sailors do is to let the wind carry them wherever it likes. That's what is meant in verse 15. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. Now, of course, it's a bit like us being driven along by whatever is going on around us. Whatever is the popular thought of the day, we will adopt and we'll go along with that. The fact that, even as here, the fact that it might drive us into deeper trouble, well, that doesn't seem to bother us. If you read the second half of Romans chapter 1, that's the picture you get of the human race sinking further and further into godlessness and becoming increasingly objects of his wrath. And if you're not familiar with that passage, you really should read it soon. But if and when we realise that we are in deep trouble, so often we try to fix the problem ourselves. We just can't let go of the idea that everything is within our control. We are sure that we can come up with the answer. And so in this account, we have the picture of the sailors seeking to secure and strengthen the ship. First of all, they bring the boat on board. There at the end of verse 16, the boat would have been what they used to get to shore if the ship had to anchor some way off land. It tended to be dragged along behind the ship. So first of all, they have to secure it. And then after that, some brave men, they would have taken ropes, maybe chains even, and they would swim under the ship and they would take the ropes and chains with them. And so basically they would tie the two sides of the ship together to seek to prevent it from breaking apart. We're very good at that. Well, what can we do? What can we do? We think that we can bolster our lives. We think that we can do great and noble things. If we do that, then God will look on us favourably. If I make a large donation to charity, if I go on some pilgrimage or other, if I save lives, surely God must be good to me. The thought that there is nothing that we can actually do does not readily come to mind. But in the end, as pictured here, all our actions prove utterly futile, because there's simply not enough that we can do that will make things right between God and us. It is a hard lesson to learn, and we can often go through great difficulties before that becomes apparent to us. And it has to be said that to some, probably many, that it never becomes apparent. But returning to the ship then, these sailors, once they've strengthened the ship, They see they are still in danger. So the next thing they do, they bring the sails down, and they're still said to be driven along, but without the sails, that driving there would not be so intense, not so speedy. But it's still like the madness of some of the ideas that are going around, and plenty of people see the madness, but they can't quite join up the dots, as we might say, because they don't have a biblical worldview. So they might avoid that particular madness, but they get carried along by other things that are also going on around us, all kinds of godless ideologies. Well, the next thing these sailors do, having strengthened the ship, they see that that's not to any avail, so they start throwing things off the ship. Verse 18, they start dispensing with the cargo, and then in verse 19, they start throwing off those things that are a bit superfluous to the ship itself. And that's rather like we ourselves seeking to reform our lives. For example, we see that materialism hasn't been of any help to us, so we start offloading all the things that we have acquired, hoping that a more simple life will fix everything. But again, it doesn't help. Now, it's true to say that materialism does blind us to the truth, so it's no bad thing to live a simpler life. But that in itself is no help, because it is still all about you. And so here in the ship we read in verse 20, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. And that is the point that we must all come to. We have to recognise that no amount of doing on our part will help us. We have to abandon such thoughts. Now, these sailors, they were lost in darkness when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared. Because all humans are lost in spiritual darkness. But then comes the gospel, a message from heaven itself. Here, Paul tells them that he's received a message via an angel from the God of heaven. And it is such good news that they need not fear. Indeed, he says, be of good cheer, he says to them. And that's like a little mini gospel in itself, isn't it? The gospel is a message of life. Paul says here, there shall be no loss of life among you. Paul declares his faith in God. I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. And in saying that, he's urging the others to believe likewise. The reason the gospel brings life is because it does not require us to do anything. It requires us to have faith in Jesus Christ, to be specific. For Jesus has done that which is necessary to reconcile man to God. As you know, he took the sins of his people, he took them as if they were his own, and he bore the punishment that they incurred. All we have to do is just trust him. One of the reasons so many do not enjoy what the gospel holds out is because they think it's all too simple. But why let the simplicity of a thing hold you back from enjoying it? And that is little short of madness. It's a bit like wanting to go to the FA Cup final and then refusing to take a free ticket out of the hand of a friend that is offering it to you. And of course, life, eternal life at that, is of far greater worth than an FA Cup final ticket. And although I have emphasised that you do not have to do anything to be reconciled to God, I guess it's only fair to say that you do need to let go of the world. As Paul said, there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. Sticking with the ship would be disastrous. So I say we need to abandon the world entirely. We have to give up thoughts of strengthening ourselves or of putting this thing right or that thing right in our lives. What we all have to do is wholeheartedly, with our whole being, cast our lot in with Jesus. We must turn away from the world and how we have previously behaved and simply put our faith in Jesus Christ as our Lord. So I simply ask, as we finish, will you do that? Have you done it? Will you do that today, if not? Well, we're going to close in a moment. We're going to sing hymn number 403, which says, "Out of my bondage, sorrow and night, Jesus, I come, Jesus, I come." 403. Out of my bondage, sorrow and night, Jesus, I come, Jesus, I come.